Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first set of keynotes here for the PPP Building Resilience 2020 session. My name is Lawrence Bowdish, and we're here in our first set of keynotes. I'm joined by Professor Rebecca Henderson, who I'll introduce in detail in a moment. But I want to just make sure that everyone's in the right place. This is called Reimagining Capitalism. We're going to be talking a little bit broadly about how the private sector and its capitalism and its capitalist system can really play a very vital role in resilience, recovery, and response for disasters, both in the natural setting and in the setting we're seeing today. So as we get started, I just want to remind everyone, happy to take questions across two different platforms. We're going to have Hub, the platform you're in. I'll be watching that for questions. Also, if you're watching the YouTube live stream, I'll be watching those as well. So with no further ado, I do want to introduce Professor Rebecca Henderson, who, if I were to give her full background, we'd take the hour we have. So I will give an abridged background. She's one of 25 university professors at Harvard. She's also a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, and a fellow of both the British Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's an expert on innovation and organizational change, and her research, we'll talk about today, the newest version of it, explores the degree to which the private sector can play a major role in building a more sustainable economy, focusing particularly on the relationships between organizational purpose, which a lot of people here know a lot about, innovation and productivity, and high performance organizations. She has taught a course based on what she's going to be talking about today that has grown from just a few dozen students to over 300. And it's the basis for the book that we'll be talking about today, Reimagining, sorry, my Southern came out there, excuse me, Capitalism in a World on Fire. She sits on the boards of IDEX Labs and Ceres. Her publications include not only this book, but Leading Sustainable Change and Organizational Perspective and Accelerating Energy Innovation, Lessons from Multiple Sectors. She was named one of 3 Outstanding Directors of 2019 by the Financial Times. So what I'd like to start with, Professor, is once we've got your introduction there, would you mind giving the audience here, who, as we discussed the other day, are largely folks in the disaster recovery space, most of them are going to be private sector, just give them an overall view of your arguments in reimagining capitalism to make sure we're all on the same page before we move forward.
Lawrence, I'd be happy to do that, and do feel free to call me Rebecca. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a nearly 300-page book in about 15 minutes. And I'm going to suggest that if you're interested in resilience and disasters, that you'll find this pretty interesting. I want to talk about the role of business in disasters. My book focuses on what I'm thinking of as an ongoing, slow-moving series of disasters, particularly the massive environmental degradation we're seeing, and in particular, the problem of climate change, and accelerating poverty and exclusion, more and more people feeling they're being locked out of our societies, and our increasing polarization. Sometimes it feels as if our political institutions are almost broken. So the book focuses on those big problems and says, what can business do? What should business do? And the reason I think you might find this interesting is that as I talk about those issues, I get a range of puzzling responses. One response is, let's just get rid of business altogether. Sometimes when I say I'm going to talk about reimagining capitalism, people say to me, why reimagine? Why reimagine capitalism? Why not just throw it out the window? Isn't it broken? Isn't business evil? Isn't it an irredeemable system that we should just start over? To which I reply, please not. Really, that would be a bad idea. I teach at the Harvard Business School. I am an out-and-out capitalist for, I think, pretty good reasons. I think of capitalism as one of the great inventions of the human race. Really, an unparalleled source of innovation and productivity and creativity. I'm a huge fan of competition. I think it drives firms to behave better, to become more efficient. I'm a huge fan of free markets. I think prices are amazing in the way they allocate resources across, hundreds of thousands of firms to make us things like cell phones and the latest vaccine drug and so on. So the response, we have major problems, the answer is to kill capitalism, seems to me a mistake. I don't think we're going to solve the problems that we face without capitalism. The other response I get is business should fix everything. It's all business's fault, so business should fix everything. So, if we have a climate change problem, all the firms should immediately switch to clean energy. If we have an inequality and exclusion problem, firms should raise their wages, hire people of color. If we have a political problem, firms should, immediately stop doing whatever bad thing they're doing and fix it. And I love the way these two things go together, right? Firms are evil, but we want them to show up and fix things. And my impression is that is what happens at many natural disasters right now. That the observers are torn between, oh my God, one of the reasons we're in this mess is because business didn't do the right thing, but we really want business to fix it. And we want business to go the extra mile. And, business is rich. Why not? Why don't they just write the check? And so there's this very ambivalent reaction to business in local disasters, as there is, I think, at this broader, more systemic level. And I want to talk about how I've found a useful way to think about that tension. People are indeed really angry at business. Right now, a recent survey suggested that only about 25% of the American public believe that capitalism is working for them. So there's a lot of mistrust and anger. And I think some of that is to be understood. But I also believe that business is a huge part of the solution. I don't think business should throw the need to maximize profits out the window, but I do think business should be aware that they do have a role to play, both in these local disasters and, as I said, in the sort of ongoing society, global level disaster that we're facing at the moment. And it's finding that middle path that I think is tricky and really important. So I wrote the book I just published, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, to really support business in trying to thread this needle, in acknowledging that every business has to make a profit and that that's the nature of capitalism, but to suggest that at the same time, business can and must play an important role in addressing these kinds of major problems. In the book, I lay out, 5 steps, 5 easy steps to saving the world. Not that they're easy. Everything I talk about is hard. But let me give you a flavor of what I talk about, and I hope it might be helpful to you as you think about closer in and more short-term disasters as well. The first is, in my experience, too many firms are too focused on the short term. They have persuaded themselves that they need to maximize profits right here, right now, and often managers are paid by the quarterly number. I remember talking to a business person at a major corporation about a big program in innovation and all the things we were going to do. And he looked at me at one stage and he said, Rebecca, I wake up with my number. I go to sleep with my number. I take my number on vacation. So if we're realistic, many firms are run on short-term numbers. And sometimes that's entirely appropriate. We need to run a tight ship. Constantly reducing costs and seeking efficiency is how firms grow and thrive and make sure they're running at full capacity. But sometimes it's a mistake. And I think particularly at moments of discontinuity or difficulty when new issues come up, things like a major natural disaster, things like the Black Lives Matter movement and all the anger and fear about how people of color have been treated in this country, things like climate change, the organization says, well, it's not my short-term interest to think about it, go away. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake for a number of reasons. Firstly, if you think collectively for a moment, and I know this is kind of a stretch, but let's pretend that I personally control every company on the face of the planet. If I control every company, I think I have a strong interest in making sure that the world addresses some of these major problems. in fixing disasters, in supporting communities as they struggle, in working with government to build a more equitable society and address problems like climate change. I think if I own all of business, I want a strong, capable, transparent government that can be a partner with me in addressing these kinds of issues. All the historical research, at least my reading of it, and the work in development economics and political economy, suggests that healthy societies stand on three legs. One is a strong free market, absolutely hugely important, drives prosperity, creates great jobs, creates freedom of opportunity. But there are two other legs to that stool. The second leg, and for some of you this is going to be a bit revolutionary, but let me try. The second leg is a democratically accountable, capable, transparent, responsive government. That there are some problems that free markets cannot solve. Free markets are not great, most obviously, at generating really good education, really good healthcare, roads, the kind of infrastructure we need, public order. There are things that only government can do. And as we think about the major problems we face, like climate change, like poverty and exclusion, like AI and robotics coming soon near you, going to get rid of millions of jobs if we're not careful. My guess, my strong belief is that we need government as a partner in addressing those kinds of problems, providing public goods, creating regulation that makes it expensive to dump greenhouse gas pollution into the atmosphere and have very significantly negative effects on human health and on the long-term stability of the climate. So we need that strong, democratically accountable government. And then we need a strong civil society, by which I mean a strong media, a independent judiciary, and again, a little controversial, some way for employees to express their own opinions and stand up for themselves. We could call it works councils, we could call it unions historically, but if you look at the data, it's those three pillars that build a strong society. Free markets are amazing, but they need guardrails. They need, we need to make sure that firms can't push to the lowest common denominator, can't set the rules in their own favor. One of the issues we face at the moment is more than 70% of Americans believe that the game is rigged, that the rich are writing the rules in their own advantage. And the horrible thing is there's some evidence that that's actually the case. And so we need a strong democracy to balance free markets. One of my students once said to me, well, wait, isn't government tyranny? And I said, well, yeah, government gone amok absolutely is tyranny. That's why you need a strong democracy. That's why you need the transparency. That's why you need to be able to vote them out. But at its best, free politics is just like the free market. You get to choose, you get to vote as to what the rules should be and how things should be run. So I think that balancing those three is absolutely critical. And what I talk about in the book is the way in which business can build business models that support that work in partnership with government. I talk about billion-dollar business models that allow firms to address environmental problems and reduce inequality and address poverty. I talk about the importance of being purpose-driven, of having this broader view of the society in mind, of reclaiming the idea that business is an integral part of society and a trusted partner in building a healthy society that offers jobs to all. And I talk a little bit about how business can cooperate together to address problems that no business can address alone. And my guess is that many of these ideas are immediately relevant to dealing with the kinds of disasters we face on a daily basis and the ongoing disaster we're facing right now. If you think about the moment we're in, it's become clear that strong government working in partnership with a strong private sector is I believe, the only way we're going to address the problem of the pandemic and get the society back on its feet. And that it's that partnership that yields the long-term results. So for me, it's not about throwing capitalism out. I continue to believe one of the great inventions of the human race. And it's not about having business do everything. It's about finding a way for business to do what it does best: innovate, provide amazing capabilities, generate stuff at scale in partnership with government to address the major social and economic problems we face. So 300 pages in 15 minutes. How did I do, Lawrence?
Very well, very well. I got it. I got it. Great. See everyone later. No. So I'm happy again to take questions from either the YouTube or the hub. I'll start by sort of incorporating some comments we got on the YouTube with something I was thinking about. Rebecca, as you were discussing, the things that need to be associated with strong capitalism, I kind of thought, man, these were the same conversations that were happening 230 years ago in Paris, right? And 270 and like 200 years ago in Germany. And it seems like we're having these same conversations, but what's happening, I don't want to put too fine a point on the connectivity of the world now and how these conversations have to be more global in a sense than they were before. But how can you sort of talk about what you were talking about, because it seems like you're talking about it on a unitary society basis, right? This, for a society to have a successful capitalism, that society needs a successful democratically elected government that's transparent. It needs to have this. Can you talk a little bit about how, and we're talking about Adam Smith, there aren't multiple capitalisms, but how can multiple capitalistic societies work together to ensure that they can all lift each other up, which honestly in a COVID world is going to be, I think, more important than general. So
very carefully. It's tough, right? Nations have their own interests at heart, but I think it's becoming even clearer, and the pandemic has made it super clear. None of us are well until all of us are well. A world in which COVID is lurking in other countries is going to be a dangerous world for Americans and for Europeans, even once we have it licked inside our own boundaries. And climate change, we can completely decarbonize our own society that is moved to nothing but renewables and nuclear energy and address the problems of climate change right here in the US. And by the way, I think we absolutely could do that. And we have the technology, we have the resources, the price is well worth paying to head off the really horrible effects that there's a serious risk we'll face if we do nothing. But if we only do it in the US, it's not going to help, right? Because the Indians and the Chinese are busy industrializing, they want what we have, and so the risk is that they will burn fossil fuels to get it. So how do we think about global institutions? Well, better minds than I have grappled with this and failed, but I have a couple of guesses. One is these much maligned institutions of international cooperation, things like the World Health Organization or the World Bank, or even the United Nations. These are attempts to give a forum for countries to sit down and talk to each other about the long term. And if we think, for example, about the Paris Agreement, the Global Paris Agreement, which was signed a few years ago, and every country in the world except for 2 signed on to a phased reduction in emissions. Or take the global law of the sea, which every country in the world except 1 signed up for, which was a way of thinking about how do we manage, the oceans, which are a resource to all of humanity, which all of humanity has an interest in preserving. And that was a global law with, I think, some very sensible ideas as to how to make sure we don't fish out all the fish and destroy all the coral reefs. So we have examples of international cooperation that are at least first steps towards something more global, and that are first steps while still respecting national sovereignty. And then there's another example I want to talk about, and that's the International Chamber of Commerce, which is a completely voluntary organization of private firms that manages global trade. It's completely voluntary, it's completely self-regulation, it sets its own rules, it enforces its own rules, it has its own courts, and it manages pretty much all of global trade. And so we have at the global level, the ability of firms to cooperate to produce things that they all want. And I think when we think about combining some of that power, I mean, after all, 1,000 firms between them control, you pick a number, but by some reckoning, about 70% of the world's GDP, which is kind of creepy. But on the other hand, is sort of good news, right? So we have 1,000 firms that, and many of them can see that the problems we're facing are problems for them. The world's largest investors can see that the big problems we're facing are problems for them. I did some work with the chief investment officer of the Japanese pension fund, which is the largest pool of money in the world. It's $1.6 trillion in assets. And he said the largest threats to the long-term return of my portfolio and to the pensions of the Japanese are climate change and social inclusion. The fact that if you're a woman in Japan, it's super hard to get a decent job and there are all kinds of barriers in the way. And he saw these very large social problems as the issues he had to fix in order to ensure he got the financial returns he wanted. And more investors are seeing that. And so you've got, I think, a global consciousness among business that could be really helpful in supporting a global consciousness among nations. So again, that partnership I talked about, and look, I know it's really easy for me to just mumble this word partnership. I have many friends who are trying to make this work in detail on the ground. For example, there's a big global partnership around improving human rights in mining and minerals. And there's a UN set of guiding principles that are guiding this kind of conversation, but in detail, on the ground, mine by mine, community by community, it's hard. But if you have a sense of what you're trying to accomplish, if you have a sense that we'll all be better off if we respect each other and respect the capacity and capabilities we all bring, then that's a much more productive way forward than simply a kind of name calling and retreating to our corners.
Absolutely, and we are getting some questions that are great, sort of that are great last questions. So I'm going to build up to them. But Deanna and Angie, thank you. So one of the things you're talking about there, Rebecca, was partnership, right? Working together, collaboration. Let's take a minute to talk about the other side of that, conflict, right? Is conflict productive to capitalist success, right? And I think if you look at the past century of times of either honest to God global war or just internal social conflict, there are some winners, right? Some market agents do win in conflict, but obviously not everyone does. And I'm curious, there is a way, as opposed to trying, as you say, it's easy to say, oh yeah, everyone partner up. That's easy to say and hard to do. Is there another argument to say, hey, look, if you guys are going to operate in conflict, that's going to have a much bigger negative impact than if you don't partner together? I'm curious if you can spin that around a little bit.
So first, there are times and places where conflict is incredibly productive. I mean, no,
Yeah.
let's be clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
If what you want to do is, let's take a real example. You want to find a vaccine for COVID? You're much better off having 15 firms invest and run like crazy than you are trying to choose like the one firm at the beginning. So there are times when, let's call it competition, is super important. But there are times when it's incredibly destructive. So for example, I was working with a big consumer goods firm called Unilever at the time when they decided that deforestation was a big threat to the health of their business. They were getting a lot of pressure from NGOs. People in monkey suits were climbing all over their headquarters buildings. They had these images like they were killing orangutans, and it was bad. So they said, okay, we've got to have sustainably grown stuff, beef, pork, beef, soy, palm oil, and so on. So good. Well, so bad, because that was quite expensive and consumers weren't willing to pay more. So what do? They went to all the other firms in their industry and they said, look, you have the same problem we do. If we keep competing, if we keep pushing the price of these major agricultural commodities down and down and down, And this happened in textiles, where Nike and Levi went to the other textile people and said, if we keep pushing wages down and we keep tolerating things like child labor in the name of low costs, we will destroy the whole industry. So cooperation was the only way forward. I'm going to use a sports analogy, which is super dangerous because not only am I female, but I'm also British. But here goes. Think about a rugby game. A rugby game is immensely competitive, right? Big, beefy people running as hard as they can at each other. Massive competition, but huge cooperation. Agreement on the rules of the game. Agreement on how the league is set up. Agreement on how players are recruited, agreement on the context within which competition takes place. And that's how we need to think about this balance between cooperation and competition. So in the textile case, Nike said, we cannot employ child labor. It is completely morally wrong, but our consumers hate it, and it's not good in the long term for the health of our supply chain. So yes, individual competition will get us employing children because, hey, they're cheap and they have little, fingers, great manual dexterity, but not okay. Let's set the rules of the game so we don't do that. And so I think it's all about how does business help shape the rules of the game in a way that's in the interests of the society as a whole, that supports business, but also supports the society.
Absolutely. So some more questions here. I'm going to try to combine them a little bit and get some to the heart of disaster. We've had a couple of questions come in across the platforms about income inequality, which is obviously a consequence of capitalism in some forms. But I want to combine a little bit with some of the disaster issues we talked about yesterday, right? Because when we were getting ready for this, one of the things that we discussed was whether or not, again, you had talked about your friend who goes to sleep with his number, takes the number on vacation. Well, that number is never more than 3 months off, right? I mean, and so whether or not capitalism can be incentivized to engage in particularly locally based disaster recovery programs. And so, because one of the things we talked about the other day was a place like New York in 2005 or even Miami in 92 recovered very quickly. They had, the devastation was very high. It took 6 to 12 months, but it recovered quickly, as opposed to a New Orleans, New York in 2011, as opposed to New Orleans in 2005 or a Joplin, Missouri with a tornado a year or two later. They still haven't recovered. Both their populations are still less than it was a decade ago. The number of businesses there are still less than it was a decade ago. So are there areas in which, if we think about income inequality, not for individuals necessarily, but happy to comment on if you'd like, but for areas, and then use that to talk about capitalism's ability to engage as a real force for recovery in those areas?
So the question is, does business have an interest in being part of a healthy community where wages are in general higher versus than lower, and things like healthcare systems and education are working pretty well? And I think the answer to that is overwhelmingly yes. I mean, see where businesses choose to locate. They want to be in healthy societies where there's a big pool of talent and it's properly trained. And when that happens, you get a reinforcing circle, wages rise. So that's where a lot of businesses want to be. So if you think about the difference between Miami and New Orleans, say, part of it might be a matter of scale. I mean, this is not my subject, but I'm guessing, New Orleans was significantly smaller with a much less diversified economy. So that might be one reason it's had more trouble recovering. But another might be that in Miami and New York, there was a clear sense among business leaders that they had a strong interest in the long-term health of that community. And to take your point about the quarterly returns, because lots of people have their numbers, how do you make a business case for that? Well, let's think about that. You can make a business case in terms of brand. So when, for example, Walmart went into New Orleans, and they went in like full throat. I mean, the CEO said to his people, I don't care about the budget, send what is needed. which for a company like Walmart to say is pretty amazing. But why did he say that? Partly he said it because he thought it was the right thing to do, but partly was because Walmart had a massive PR problem. And being seen to be that effective and that efficient and that central was very, very helpful for their PR. The thing that also happened to Walmart, and I've seen it happen in other companies that have made these kinds of seemingly risky decisions to give a little bit more, to invest a little bit more, is the effect it has on employees and customers and suppliers. So literally last night, I was doing a conference call with the CEO of a Filipino power company called FirstGen. And their major generating facility was hit by a typhoon a few years ago, a massive typhoon, the most powerful typhoon ever, he told me, ever to hit anywhere in the world. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he said. And he said they made the decision to do what was necessary to fix the community. And it was expensive. They spent a lot of money. They hired planes and helicopters. They flew in rice and fuel supplies, and they rebuilt the roads. And he said, you know, most of the time they were kind of crossing their fingers like, I guess this is the right thing to do. I really hope it's the right thing to do. And he said, after the fact, no question that when he came to renegotiate the union contract with the 47 unions, the unions looked at him and said, Mr. Lopez, we're not going to ask for anything this year. I mean, after what you did for our community, we're not asking. He says levels of engagement in the companies, so the engagement scores, are like 93%. And this is 5 years later. No one has engagement scores like that. Even, you know, like really great high-tech firms have like in the 80s. 93 is off scale. Yeah. He said his community engagement score is up in the 90s. It's letting him do things on the ground and with his people that most companies cannot do. And, you know, it's easy to talk about purpose, and there's a lot of mumbling about firms should have a purpose, but really having an authentic purpose, really being committed to the community where you're located and being part of that, there is tons of research to suggest that significantly increases your productivity and your innovation, your ability to recruit and retain. You know, we know the young people really care about this stuff, like they really care. My students talk to me all the time about turning down more highly paid jobs because they want a job that has meaning and mission and where they're going to make a difference. So my guess is that some of those firms in New York and Miami stepped up. And in stepping up, they pulled in other firms to help. And of course, once all the firms are working together, then it becomes a virtuous cycle, right? So together, you are building a stronger community. And so I think there is a business model, there is a way to drive cooperation and for firms to overcome that quarterly bias in order to do the right thing, because the right thing is the profitable thing.
100%. And with you bringing up particularly your example about the power companies, some of the questions we've had, particularly Deanna's and Angie's and Hub, talk about that PR, right? You'd mentioned in your introduction that a lot of times, you know, public employees of the companies, these scores are getting worse, you know, not only for, you know, capitalism generally, but the private sector a little more specifically, and corporations particularly. And I'm curious, you know, obviously it is not a strategy that anyone is suggesting that a company just kind of waits for a disaster and then pounces on it, right? As a way to manage that. But, you know, one thing, you know, in researching for disaster responses, the largest disaster response in history came after the burning of Rome, right, in the classical era. And it was by Nero, the guy who's often blamed for it, right? And so he spent, you know, massive amounts of money to rebuild Rome from the ground up. Now, that didn't do much for his press, because now we just know him as the guy that sort of sat there and fiddled while the place burned down around him. But I'm curious, thinking about, you know, either capitalism generally, or, you know, we've been talking a little bit about how corporations can engage in disaster recovery response activities. how can they, like, are there tactics or strategies that not ensure, but can help raise that level of sentiment for capitalism and or the private sector amongst the public particularly?
The problem is that there's no shortcut, no fancy PR campaign, no writing a check to some big charity. I mean, I think about what's happened recently in response to George Floyd's murder, and all these CEOs issuing statements about, oh, we really care, you know, we really want to include everyone. And partly they're issuing those statements because there is a very powerful business case. I mean, within the next 20 years, more than half of the talent pool is going to be people of color, and more than half of the consumers are going to be people of color. So, you know, when people go, oh, right, there's only 4 CEOs of the Fortune 500 that are Black, you know, like what's with that? So they're all issuing these statements madly. And does that help? No. In many cases, it makes people angrier. What really helps is setting concrete targets and changing your procedures. I mean, that sounds so bureaucratic, right? But it's changing the firm to actually do something. Even if it's small, even if it's stumbling, it's trying something real to make a difference. And what's so important is to be authentic. And what does it mean to be authentic? And there's a lot of fake authenticity, but again, people have pretty good radar for real authenticity. My personal definition of a firm that's authentic is a firm that occasionally takes a financial hit to do the right thing. And that's how you can tell, right? So yeah, oh, we really care about people of color and we're really going to hire them. Oh, we have a downturn, we're going to stop. Well, you know, any benefit that you may have put in place completely out the window. So one of the things that really worked for Walmart is he really did say, like, no, I don't care about the budget. Let's just do what's right. And he really empowered people. He said to everyone on the ground, just, you know, give it away. If that's what it takes, give it away. And I take a lot of grief for claiming that Walmart is a purpose-driven firm, but I really believe it. I think it was purpose-driven at the very beginning when Mr. Walton founded the firm and he wanted to get goods to people in remote rural areas of the States who'd never had access. And he was all about low cost and getting people a better quality of life. And then there was a kind of intermediate period, not so great. We could talk more about that later. But I think particularly the current CEO, he really means it. He really thinks Walmart can make a difference in the world. And he keeps doing things consistent with that belief. He keeps insisting on investing in the longer term, even when it isn't exactly the right thing to do. When he put in place a big wage raise for the people at the firm. Stock fell by 20%. You know, some people think he was nearly fired. I mean, other CEOs would have been fired. The chair of his board is a Walton, and he was Rob Walton was 100% behind Doug, behind the CEO, so he kept his job. But whoa, but what better way to illustrate that you're really serious? I talk in the book about a man called Mark Bertolini, who is the CEO of a company called Aetna, a big health insurance company, very bad reputation. You know, no one likes the health insurance industry. It's like one of the least liked industries in the country. And he found out by accident that about 12% of his employees were making minimum wage. And he went to talk to them. And he found out a number of things. They were on food stamps. They were on Medicaid. That a lot of them were women. A lot of them were single women struggling, working 2 jobs to try and make ends meet. And they were answering his phones. They were his customer service reps. And he said, wait, I have people who are desperate, who are struggling to make ends meet, who pretty much hate me because they can't afford the health insurance product that we're selling as a firm. And they're answering my phone. And he went back to his senior team and he said, we are raising their wages. And they said, whoa, that won't maximize shareholder value. We're just paying prevailing wage. He said, did you not understand? We are raising their wages. Now, of course, he's responsible to his investors. He believed, and subsequent events really brought him out, that their increased focus and sense of well-being would more than pay for the increase in wages, which was about $20 million. So for 12% of his workforce, he brought people up to a living wage and gave them healthcare they could afford. And this is at a time when Aetna's profits were like $3-4 billion. And he said the effect across the rest of the firm, oh, you really mean it? He'd been trying to change the firm. He'd been trying to make it more purpose-driven, trying to make it more about patient health and customer health rather than just the bottom line. And people said, whoa, you're willing to do that? Maybe you really mean it. So concrete actions, being authentic. I mean, it's something every human really understands. I mean, unless you're a psychopath, you understand what it takes to build trust. And that's what we need to do. This constant, like, oh, I'm maximizing shareholder value. I mean, that's not going to motivate anyone to do anything. And I think it's often a lousy way to maximize shareholder value.
100%. And that's interesting. So one of the questions that have come in is about asking for the difference between shareholder and stakeholder and corporations that may lean one way or another. I don't think this is from Rob. I don't think it's necessarily a question about explain B Corps, but like I think it's a question about, is there, you said you can't, if you are only shareholder driven, then the only trust you need to build is with your shareholders, right? But if you're stakeholder driven, you have to convince everybody, employees, communities, everybody, that you're authentic and this is your goal and your direction. And I think it's something that might make it easier for companies that are trying to engage in disaster recovery. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about maybe the structure, if there's a structural difference between them.
So I think many people who focus only on shareholder value are unskillful. That thinking about stakeholders would be, in fact, a much more skillful way to maximize shareholder value. They say everybody needs to breathe, but breathing is not the point of living. So I think every firm needs to make money and to return a decent return to investors, but that shouldn't be the point. And running your firm with a broader point will make it not only much more fun, much more innovative. Certainly we know that firms like that can survive in a competitive marketplace, but make a huge difference to the society. So I think focusing on stakeholders is good, even if you think you need to maximize shareholder value. The question as to whether we should legally change the governance documents of firms so that we say your duty is to stakeholders is a large and complicated one. So let me say, I think it's complicated. That simply saying to firms, okay, don't have to maximize shareholder value, just do good things for stakeholders, just saying that is problematic until we can be very precise about how would you measure what doing good things for stakeholders is. And before we can be sure you can raise money if you say that, right? If I go out to the capital markets and I say, oh, I'm going to go do good things in the world, people are likely to look at me and say, Rebecca, nice. Nonprofit sector is over there, right? And so there are some firms like B Corps that have explicitly said, here's the good we want to do, and here's the measures we're going to use, and have found investors who are willing to fund them. And I think that's fantastic. And I'm all for firms becoming B Corps if that's what they want to do. But to take the vast majority of firms and say, oh, go for stakeholders, I'm afraid they'll say, well, great, my stakeholder is my niece, and I'm going to buy 3 corporate jets and, fly us around. So I think being focused on the bottom line, having clear measures is super important. And I worry that sometimes the stakeholder conversation will move us away from that. That said, in the long term, for sure, there are things we could do so we could back firms off from having to be quite so short-sighted and quite so quarterly focused and more aware of the long term. And there's a whole conversation about ESG. I have a whole chapter in my book called Rewiring Finance about how we might move the capital markets to support more stakeholder-oriented, more purpose-driven firms for everyone's benefits, including theirs. So that gets technical, but I think the bottom line is all firms should be focused on stakeholders. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean forgetting that, you can't crash the company. You have to be profitable. You have to be able to raise capital at the same time.
So that's interesting. Let's talk for a minute with your business school experience and background, what we find at the chamber, one, we work with a lot of companies in disaster response, and most of them are quite large. For fear of forgetting one, I won't list them, but there are a number, about a dozen or so companies we work with closely, all of them quite large. When we work with companies that are growing and are looking to become public, right? So now we're thinking about companies that are, on that growth trajectory. They decide that, okay, now's the time. We sort of sucked up all the capital we could suck up without selling ourselves, right? And they've gotten to that point. We talked to some companies in that space that have a hard time, if they have been, mission driven, purpose driven, stakeholder driven. They find they have a hard time putting together all of the necessary things to go public, have an IPO, et cetera, that allow them to keep that and still do that effectively, like enter the public market effectively. And I think for a lot of companies, and the reason I'm tying this to disaster is I think for a lot of companies that are going to do more, and local companies do a lot, obviously. When local disasters hit their local areas, obviously they're an amazing, partner. But if they want to become systematic about it, right, and they want to do things, anytime a fire hits, a hurricane hits, make sure we have the process in place to go help them no matter where they are. They generally need to be at that IPO step. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts or examples about how companies might not lose their identity when they have to sort of fit into the mechanisms required to have a public offering.
So I think there are two paths. The first is to explicitly incorporate as a B corporation. So to be very clear that you have measures beyond only profit maximization, to be clear about how you're going to measure your performance, and to go to a more limited pool of investors and say, will you fund us? And for some firms, that's a very successful route. If you don't think you'll raise the money you need, or you don't want to go that far, and you want to be a kind of regular publicly traded company, I think the answer is measurement, to be very precise about your strategy and how you're going to pursue it. It's not that the capital market is inherently stupid and short-term oriented, although I can appreciate it sometimes feels like that. But we know that can't be absolutely true, because otherwise Jeff Bezos would never have existed for all those years as a public company, losing hundreds of millions of dollars. Or to take an even more prosaic example, I was on the board of a pharmaceutical company for a very long time. We spent billions of dollars on long-term genetic biomedical research, which we knew and investors knew if we were lucky, we would get a return on in 10 years. But both Jeff Bezos and the pharmaceutical firms have got good at doing is talking about the business model. So if you can explain why the fact that you have deep capacity to respond to disasters and that you're intimately involved with your local community and you are ready to move when something happens, why that's integral to your business model, and you can show them examples and you can measure some of the responses, then you, I think, have a much better shot at raising the money you need. Because, people want to give money to thoughtful managers that are focused on the long term. There's a ton of research on whether firms that perform well on ESG outperform more conventional companies. I have two problems with that research. One, current ESG metrics are dirty as heck. So, why would we think they'd be correlating with anything? I mean, people are reporting on all kinds of stuff that we wouldn't think would be relevant to their business. And the second is, my guess is that what being purpose-oriented buys you is not outperformance. It's not like, become purpose-oriented and you'll always have more profit than more conventional firms. I think that's really unlikely. And if it were true, everyone would be purpose-oriented. I think it's much more likely that what's going on is it makes you more resilient. It makes you more innovative. It makes you much better able to deal with the shocks that come your way. And so showing that you're ready for shocks and that you can do that, technically what it's doing is reducing long-term risk. And I think the data is increasingly persuasive on that point, that these firms are not outperforming like, oh my God, I made much more, stock price went up much faster. It's when risks hit they're much more stable. And indeed, in COVID, the early data suggests that during the pandemic, these more purpose-driven firms have outperformed other firms quite systematically.
That's a great point, and we'll end with a question, but I'll add to that for very, very briefly. When we were looking at, the fact that some people think capital markets are unintelligent, when we were looking 5 or 6 years ago at sustainability rankings, right? Because back then ESG wasn't quite de rigueur; it was just sort of sustainability. And we looked at, I won't name them because I don't want to out them, but there was one major sustainability index, and the number one, far and away, like correlation of how a company did was the length of their sustainability report. Not any outcomes with anything they did, just how long the report was, right? And so because we had it, we had it stacked in a spreadsheet, and we weren't tracking it. And I'm like, gosh, that's like in order of page length. And so we tracked. It was so someone's just like looking at the number and putting that in there.
But Lawrence, I mean, to be fair, it took 100 years to build financial accounting. Yeah. We take it for granted now, but 50 years ago, if you had a P&G annual report, I've seen it. It says our sales are 23 million, our profits are 300,000. Stockholders wanting further detail can apply in Cincinnati in person. I mean, that's in the 20s. So of course the initial ESG is like all over the place, but that doesn't mean we couldn't build auditable, replicable material metrics. I mean, I'm sure we'll get there.
Sure. So with a few minutes left, I do want to borrow a question from Eugenice. Apologies if I've masked your name. And she talks about small companies, right? Which is something we try to end a lot of our sort of keynote conversations on, because, being the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, we generally tend to, get speakers who are from large companies and work with large companies. But we don't want to forget that for a lot of people, when they think capitalist success, they think of small companies. They think of people who successfully hire a few people and are able to support a family, start their own company. And there are, 7.9 million employers in the country, and 6.5 million of them employ fewer than 5 people, right? So I was curious if you have any sort of final thoughts about sort of the role that small companies play, sort of in reimagining capitalism. A lot of them don't have the same capacity or reason to engage in the same things you've talked about, but what role do they play in ensuring that, the 3 parts of the stool are there? What role do they play in making sure that they are good stewards of capitalist efforts? And we'll close on that comment.
My mother was an entrepreneur, and from her, I learned both some of the rewards and joys of being an entrepreneur. She was so proud of supporting herself. She had one other employee on good days. So was she self-employed? She had a little shop, and she was very proud of what she did. And I think it's one of the reasons I make these grand statements like capitalism is one of the greatest inventions of the human race. But I'm reminded that before capitalism, we had feudalism, and who got to work for themselves? Well, nobody, because the rich and powerful controlled all the resources. I mean, one of the great strengths of capitalism is when it works well, anyone can get access to the resources they need, can borrow a little, can save, and can set up their own business. Another thing I learned from her is it's super hard. I mean, running your own business is not for the faint of heart. She used to go from being incredibly busy to having no work. And every time there was no work, she'd say, oh, I know the product, I've mispriced it. It doesn't, and it was this constant roller coaster. It was a hard life. But that said, everything I've been talking about, like being stakeholder oriented and being authentic and being purpose driven, small firms have a huge advantage in exploiting that. Some of the most authentically purpose driven firms I've met have been small, and they struggle as they get bigger to keep that sense that we're a family, that we're here for the community. I mean, some of the stories I've read, I bet you've seen them too, Lawrence, about people keeping open local grocery stores, even when they felt it's dangerous, even when they're working every hour they can to manage the traffic flow and bring in the right products and do the cash flow. Why are they doing it? They're not doing it to get rich. They're doing it because they feel a commitment to their community. And will that mean, I hope it means, that when the emergency is over, people make a point of shopping there and really, really be there for them. I don't think it's a coincidence that the most successful IPO of the last 20 years, over $20 million, was a purpose-driven soybean burger company. You know, that was a firm that was all about changing the world. And they were able to take the risks that the large firms wouldn't take and go to places the large firms couldn't go and show that you could do things in a different way. Historically, so much of the innovation has come from small firms. Sometimes people ask me, and I was the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management for many years, and that's what I did. I studied large firms that were having trouble changing, and they'd say, well, what's the best way to get a large firm to change? And I'd say, find several small firms doing it much, much better and show them to the large firm. I mean, because there's such a force for competition and innovation in the economy. And I think many small firms are at the leading edge of saying, we have to do this a different way. Our society has to work for everyone. If our society doesn't thrive, we don't thrive. And really internalizing that and making it part of the DNA of the business, I think can take you to fantastic places.
Well, Rebecca, thanks very much. Right on time. For everyone joining us, for everyone joining the session for the rest of the day, we're going to take a 30-minute break, come back to a keynote session at 1, and then go on for there. But again, thank you, Rebecca Henderson from the Harvard Business School. This will be on our CCC channel on YouTube by tomorrow once we get it processed. So we offer everyone to sort of share it and link, and all of Rebecca's information is in the Hub platform if you'd like to see more about the book, more about her professional career. But thanks again, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you, Rebecca.